Have you ever felt that something was wrong in a relationship, even when everything seemed right on the surface? As if an inner voice said, "This is not love, it is control. This is not care, it is manipulation." Sometimes, what seems like affection comes disguised as demands, and what presents itself as love in reality asks you to abandon yourself to fit into the image that the other person has idealized. Carl Jung said that we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In other words, to protect yourself and grow in relationships, it is necessary to recognize the invisible games that unfold behind seemingly innocent words. And many of these games start with requests, small phrases, almost banal, but that hide deep traps. In this video, we will explore 7 types of requests that some men make. Requests that, if not recognized in time, can lead you to lose your identity, your strength, and your emotional freedom. And each of these requests is rooted in distortions of the male psyche, untreated wounds, and shadows projected onto the partner. But this video is not just about them. It is about you. It is about how to strengthen your perception, develop your psychic autonomy, and step away with courage and awareness from patterns that imprison. At the end of this journey, you will not only know how to identify these disguised requests, you will also have internal tools to position yourself with more clarity and protection. So, before we begin, if you feel that this content can help you, or can help a friend, a sister, a woman you love, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share. Spreading awareness is a way of caring for each other, and that, yes, is a type of love worth having. Shall we proceed? This request can come disguised. Sometimes it is not said outright. It may sound like, "You are always too sensitive," or "What's with all the drama?" And also, "You need to be stronger, not let this affect you." At first glance, it seems like a common criticism, but behind it there is a deeper pattern, an attempt to silence what the other person cannot embrace in themselves. Carl Jung said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. When a man is bothered by a woman's emotional expression, he is usually revealing discomfort with his own emotions, especially those he learned to repress since childhood. Anger, sadness, fear, vulnerability. Many men have been conditioned to see these emotions as signs of weakness, and therefore, throughout life, they build a rigid, seemingly invulnerable persona that needs to control the environment around it to keep this facade intact. When he asks you not to show your emotions, what he is saying unconsciously is, "I do not know how to deal with pain, neither mine nor yours, and if you show me yours, you will force me to look at mine." It is at this point that his emotional repression becomes a demand upon you, a displacement of the shadow. The woman in this scenario runs the risk of disconnecting from herself to maintain the relationship. She begins to keep silent, to hold back her tears, to be ashamed of feeling. Little by little, she becomes a restrained, contracted, fragmented version of what she really is. And the relationship, instead of being a space of meeting, turns into an invisible field of tension, where she needs to measure every emotion before expressing it. It is important to remember that repressed emotion does not disappear. It accumulates, and when it is not heard, it screams through other paths: anxiety, insomnia, guilt, psychosomatic illnesses. As Jung stated, what we do not confront in our interior will become our destiny. So how do you know if this request is present in your life? Notice if you feel afraid to talk about your feelings with him, if there is a chronic emotional silence between you, if your tears cause impatience, or if your joy is seen as exaggeration, if there is a constant effort to appear calm just to avoid conflicts. Now think, what kind of relationship are you creating if you need to hide your soul to keep it? True love does not ask you to be silent. It welcomes, it listens, it transforms itself with you. Emotional presence is what differentiates a living bond from an empty coexistence. And a man who truly loves you will not want you to disintegrate emotionally to fit into his world. This is the moment to pause. Take a deep breath. Ask yourself, where in my life was I silenced by loving? Where did I become invisible in order to be accepted? Recognizing yourself in these spaces is the first step to not repeating the cycle. In the next chapter, we will talk about another subtle but equally dangerous request: change for me. And we will reveal why this request is linked to the projection of the anima, the distortion of the feminine, and the risk of becoming an ideal instead of a whole woman. Shall we proceed? This request does not usually come as a direct order. It manifests itself gradually in small suggestions, criticisms disguised as care, looks of disapproval, conditional compliments. It may appear as, "You would look more beautiful if you wore less makeup," or "I don't like it when you speak in that tone," and also, "If you were a little calmer, we would understand each other better." And thus, without realizing it, you begin to adjust, to soften your tone, choose words more carefully, control your spontaneity, all in the name of a love that, in reality, is asking you to stop being who you are. Jung described a profound and often painful phenomenon, the projection of the anima. For him, the anima is the archetype of the feminine in a man's psyche. It represents not only the image of the external woman, but his own emotional and intuitive soul. When a man does not integrate this aspect within himself, he projects it, that is, he seeks, outside of himself, a woman who represents the wholeness that he lacks within. The problem arises when this projected image becomes a rigid ideal, a distorted mirror. Instead of seeing the woman as a real being, he sees her as a symbol of the beauty he lost, of the purity he desires, of the salvation he hopes for, and inevitably, he will try to mold her so that she corresponds to that ideal, because loving the real woman would require facing his own wounded, confused, imperfect soul. Carl Jung stated that projection transforms the world into a copy of the unrecognized face of the self. In other words, that which he still has not acknowledged within himself, he will try to control in the other. The woman, in this psychic game, ceases to be free. She comes to exist as a character in the internal theater of someone who has not yet done the work of individuating. The demand to change does not come from a place of love. It comes from a place of fear of truth, of depth, of difference. And true love does not ask for transformation as a condition. It is in itself transformative, but never at the expense of your essence. If you feel that you are constantly being educated in a relationship, that your natural gestures cause discomfort, that your identity needs to be revised for the other person to be at peace, that is a warning sign. Because a man who loves only the version of you that he invented is not really with you. He is with the projection of your unintegrated anima. Changing is a natural movement in life. We all change. But when change is demanded from the outside in and does not arise from an internal process, it creates resentment. It creates alienation. It creates an invisible but deep wound, the wound of having lost oneself. Now take a pause. Remember a relationship in which you felt you needed to fit in to be loved. What did you leave behind? What pieces of yourself were silenced in the name of acceptance? This request, change, for Mixost, is not an invitation to grow, but an attempt at control disguised as romance. And every time a woman molds herself to be what the other desires, she moves away from her own center, from her authenticity, from her archetypal strength. In the next chapter, we will explore a request even more subtle but equally destructive. Forget your past. We will understand why this demand reveals a man disconnected from his own history, and how denying the past is, in fact, denying the soul. Have you ever heard something like, "Why talk about that now? What's done is done," or "You're always dwelling on old things"? Sometimes this kind of speech comes with a tone of lightness, an appeal to practicality, but often, behind it, there is an unconscious desire to erase essential parts of your history, and above all, to avoid confronting the complexity of the human soul. Jung reminds us that there is no awakening of consciousness without pain, and there is no way to become who you truly are without integrating what has been. Your story, with all its pains, experiences, loves, mistakes, and new beginnings, forms the foundation of who you are today. Asking you to erase that is asking you to disintegrate, to become an amnesiac being, molded only for the other person's present. The man who demands that you forget your past is generally in denial of his own. He doesn't want to hear about your traumas because he doesn't face his own. He doesn't want to know about your previous relationships because he carries insecurities he prefers to hide. He cannot deal with your emotional complexity because he never had the courage to dive into his own. And here enters one of the most important principles of analytic psychology, the relationship with the unconscious. Jung stated that the unconscious is not just a repository of forgotten memories, but a living, active field that manifests in dreams, in repetitive patterns, in fears, and in inexplicable desires. Denying the past is the same as denying the language of the soul. When someone asks you to forget what you have lived, they are not only trying to avoid uncomfortable conversations, they are saying on an unconscious level, I cannot deal with the depth of your soul, and consequently they will only be able to relate to a superficial version of you. But someone who truly loves desires to know the other's soul, and knowing the soul is knowing the history, with its lights and its shadows, with its scars and its learnings. Only then is there real presence. Only then is there true intimacy. Now think, at some point in your life, were you induced to silence parts of your story, to hide your experiences so as not to seem too complicated? Have you ever felt pressured to be just the woman of the now, forgetting everything you had to go through to get here? It is necessary to recognize that the attempt to erase the past is, many times, a form of control, an attempt to mold the other into a comfortable and predictable ideal. But you did not come into the world to be predictable. You came to be whole. Denying the past is like painting a flower and forgetting the roots. No true transformation happens without the acceptance of what precedes us. And, as Jung said, only he who accepts what is prepared to change. In the next chapter, we will dive into a more emotionally manipulative request. Prove to me that you love me all the time. We will see how this demand is linked to an unresolved maternal complex, and why it tends to exhaust the woman's emotional energy until she feels drained and guilty for simply existing. At first glance, this request may seem sweet, a desire for closeness, for confirmation. Do you still love me? Why didn't you say you missed me? If you truly cared about me, you would have done it differently. These are apparently harmless phrases, even needy, but over time they become constant demands, draining the woman's emotional energy and placing upon her shoulders the burden of sustaining the other's fragile ego. Carl Jung offers us a precise view of this dynamic. Many men who have not resolved their issues with the maternal figure carry within them a deep lack which does not belong to the current relationship, but to their childhood past. The inner child, neglected or overprotected, projects itself onto the partner, expecting her to fill gaps that are not within the scope of adult love. In this scenario, the woman ceases to be a companion and becomes an emotional caregiver. She is made responsible for his constant well-being, for permanent validation, for continuous reaffirmation that she is loved, desired, needed. But this type of demand has no end, because the hole he tries to fill with her attention is internal, psychic, ancestral. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. A man who lives asking for proofs of love is not actually seeking your affection. He is being guided by an unconscious complex that dominates his actions without his realizing it. And what is the impact of this on the woman? She begins to live in a state of alert. She feels she needs to measure every gesture so as not to hurt him. She begins to give constant explanations, justify her feelings, avoid saying no to not appear cold. Little by little, she loses spontaneity. Her presence ceases to be lightness and becomes emotional service. She tries to anticipate crises, soothe insecurities, repair what isn't broken, and even so, nothing seems enough. This relationship creates an illusion of intimacy, but it is based on dependence and fear. The fear of displeasing, of being abandoned, of being accused of not loving enough. But love is not a debt. It is not proved. It is lived. When a man demands constant proof, he is saying unconsciously, I cannot trust. But trust is an internal construction. No external demonstration will be sufficient while the internal foundation is cracked. Now breathe and look inward. Have you ever felt that your love was constantly being put to the test? That, no matter how much you showed it, he always seemed to doubt? Have you found yourself living around his insecurity, trying to be perfect to not cause another crisis? This type of request is not love. It is disguised neediness. It is the wounded boy trying to protect himself inside the adult man. And as compassionate as you may be, you cannot heal his past with your present. Only he can do that if he is willing to dive into his own unconscious and integrate what was lost back there. The woman who accepts this type of constant demand runs the risk of losing herself, because instead of living the relationship as a meeting of whole souls, she comes to exist as living proof of an insecurity that is not hers. And you did not come into the world to prove anything. You came to love with freedom, with truth, with presence, not with sacrifice. In the next chapter, we will talk about a dangerous and silent request. Don't talk about this with anyone. This request is linked to the manipulative persona, emotional isolation, and control disguised as privacy. A subtle sign, but one that can mark the beginning of an emotionally abusive relationship. This phrase usually comes accompanied by a serious look, a low tone of voice, or a slight touch of emotional blackmail. This is between the two of us. Are you going to go talking about it out there? I hate when you expose our things. Apparently it is an appeal to privacy, a request for discretion. But in many cases, what is being requested is not respect for the bond. It is silence in the face of pain. Carl Jung said, "The persona is what someone is not, but that people think they are." The persona is the social mask that each of us wears to function in the world, professionally, familiarly, intimately. It is necessary, but dangerous, when confused with the true self. Some men build such a rigid persona that any exposure of the reality behind it is seen as a threat. When a man asks you not to talk about what is happening, especially when it comes to actions that hurt you, that confuse you or imprison you, he may be trying to preserve not the relationship, but the image he wants to maintain in front of the world and in front of himself. This request, when repeated frequently, has a devastating effect. The woman begins to feel guilty for seeking help. She begins to think that exposing her pain is a way of betraying the relationship. She isolates her experiences, represses her doubts, avoids conversations with friends, family, therapists, and so, little by little, she becomes a hostage of a silence built on the outside, but poisoned on the inside. This type of request creates a psychic environment ideal for the maintenance of the unconscious shadow. The shadow, according to Jung, is everything we do not want to be, but that we are. It is the denied, repressed, undesirable side of the personality, and the more it is denied, the more it acts autonomously and destructively. Relationships where silence is demanded above truth tend to become fertile ground for emotional abuse, even if subtle, even if well disguised. Have you ever felt guilty for telling someone what you were feeling in a relationship? Have you been afraid to expose your anguish and be accused of talking too much? Have you found yourself trying to protect the other's image while your own pain was being suffocated? The request to keep secrets may seem at first like a way to protect intimacy, but true intimacy is not built on forced silence, but on mutual trust. If you cannot speak, you cannot exist fully, and if you cannot exist with freedom, then you are living inside an emotional prison. The woman who hears this type of request repeatedly often internalizes the guilt. She believes she is exaggerating, that she is exposing too much, that she should not feel the way she feels. But this is the psychological effect of isolation, the loss of her own criterion of reality. Love does not demand silence about suffering. True love wants to understand, to listen, to grow together. And if what you live needs to be hidden, perhaps it is not love. Perhaps it is control disguised as intimacy. Now stop for a moment and reflect. How many times have you swallowed words that needed to be said just to not displease or unprotect someone? How much pain have you carried alone while pretending to be okay? This is the moment to break away from the logic of imposed silence, to open space for words, for testimony, for sharing. Because when pain is narrated, it begins to cease being a prison, and that, in itself, is already an act of liberation. In the next chapter, we will talk about an even more dangerous request, because it acts in an invisible, emotionally corrosive way. You are exaggerating. We will understand why this phrase, when repeated, becomes a form of gaslighting, a subtle manipulation of reality, capable of making the woman doubt her own perception. You try to explain what you felt. You describe the situation, the tone, the impact, maybe with a trembling voice, maybe with courage, and he replies, "You are exaggerating." This phrase may come with a cynical smile, with an expression of forced patience, or with aggressive impatience. But in any case, the effect is always the same: to disqualify your experience. From that point on, what was a legitimate feeling begins to be questioned. You start to ask yourself if you really felt what you felt, if you are being too sensitive, too irrational, too difficult, and thus, slowly, your perception of reality begins to be eroded. Carl Jung warned us about the dangers of being unaware of the shadow. The shadow contains everything that a person refuses to see in themselves: anger, fear, insecurity, arrogance, jealousy. When a man does not recognize his own shadow, he needs to fight it in the other, and, often, the one who is closest, the partner, becomes the target of this projection. By saying that you are exaggerating, he is not listening to what you say. He is trying to silence the dissonance between your pain and what he wants to believe about himself. He wants to maintain the image that he is reasonable, balanced, just, and any emotion that threatens that self-image needs to be discredited. This is where gaslighting comes in, a modern term for an ancient psychological mechanism, the attempt to make the other person doubt their own sanity. This is not just emotional manipulation, it is a form of psychological violence, and the more subtle it is, the more dangerous, because it is silent, disguised as rationality, as common sense, even as love. "I am only trying to help you see clearly," he says, but what he is doing in reality is extinguishing your inner light. Have you ever felt guilty for feeling? Have you doubted your own perception because someone accused you of seeing things where there are none? Have you hesitated to express discomfort for fear of seeming crazy or too emotional? This type of psychic environment causes the woman to lose confidence in herself. She begins to self-analyze obsessively, searching for the origin of the supposed exaggeration. She starts walking on eggshells, recalculating words, anticipating reactions, and the relationship becomes an emotional battlefield where she is always trying to prove that she is not wrong for feeling. Jung reminds us that what you deny submits you, what you accept transforms you. A man who repeatedly denies the legitimacy of your feelings is trapped by a fragile ego that cannot handle confrontation. He does not love your soul. He wants to control your narrative. But the soul does not accept being silenced for long. It begins to become ill, to contract, to hide itself. And when this happens, something essential is lost: confidence in oneself. And without that confidence, the woman begins to live in the other's world, disconnected from her own intuition, from her own truth, from her own inner wisdom. This request, "You are exaggerating," this may seem small, but it is a gateway to self-abandonment. Now breathe and ask yourself, how many times were you convinced that you felt incorrectly? How many emotions did you swallow just to keep the peace? You are not exaggerating. You are sensitive, intuitive, emotionally intelligent. And if someone cannot deal with that, the problem is not in you, it is in their inability to grow. In the next chapter, we will talk about the seventh and last request, perhaps the most dangerous of all. "If you leave me, I will destroy everything." We will explore why this type of phrase reveals a threatening, unintegrated shadow and how to recognize the signs of a destructive emotional bond. This phrase is not just an emotional outburst. It is not about longing, nor about the genuine fear of losing someone. It carries a tone of blackmail, of pressure, of psychic invasion. Behind it, there is a silent warning: if you leave, you will carry the guilt for my pain. In its most serious form, this speech touches the threshold of suicide, of self-destruction, of the veiled and sometimes explicit threat that your freedom will cost the other their collapse. Carl Jung said that the shadow is everything a person refuses to acknowledge in themselves, but which is, in fact, part of them. When this shadow remains unintegrated for too long, it begins to manifest destructively: possessive jealousy, obsessive control, outbursts of anger, self-harm. And when a man says he will destroy everything if left, he is not just trying to maintain a relationship. He is trying to avoid the collapse of the ego that has been built on the bond. In these cases, the woman is no longer a partner. She becomes his emotional lifeline. Her presence is no longer desired out of love, but demanded as a medicine for an internal abyss he refuses to face. And, in this scenario, the relationship turns into a prison disguised as affection. The veiled threat, even when spoken with tears in the eyes, is a form of violence, because it forces the woman to assume a responsibility that is not hers, to keep the other person alive, emotionally stable, in balance, even when that costs her own psychic health. It is important to remember that this dynamic is deeply rooted in the fear of abandonment. Jung warned us that the human soul, when undeveloped, tends to cling to the other as a way to avoid confronting the inner void. And when that other person threatens to leave, despair takes over, not because of love, but because of what love was hiding. The unhealed wound, the unaddressed void, the trauma never processed. If you have ever heard this phrase, or some version of it, you know how heavy it is. You know what it is like to feel that your freedom can cause a tragedy, that your desire to leave can be interpreted as an act of cruelty. And, over time, this guilt can become so strong that the woman stays not out of love but out of fear, out of pity, out of distorted responsibility. But here is the hardest and most liberating truth. You are not responsible for the pain that the other person avoids facing. You are not anyone's therapist, savior, or anchor, and any love that is based on the fear of loss is not love. It is dependence. This type of bond is toxic, not only emotionally, but spiritually, because it prevents growth. It prevents individuation, the central process of Jung's psychology, which is the path to becoming who you really are. And individuation demands freedom. It demands that you can leave, if necessary, that you can say no, that you can move on. Now stop, breathe. Remember a situation in which your departure seemed like a sentence for the other person, where you felt you had no choice, that you were trapped in their suffering, even though your own was becoming unbearable. You are not alone. Many women have already experienced this type of psychic prison, and many, when they finally managed to free themselves, discovered a strength they didn't even know they had. The shadow, when confronted with consciousness, loses its destructive power, but when ignored, it becomes dangerous, not only for the one who carries it, but for everyone around. So, if you are in a relationship where this type of threat exists, know this: there is a way out. There is life after this. There is love that does not demand sacrifice. There is presence that does not threaten. There is freedom that does not come with guilt. In the next chapter, we will gather the main learnings from this journey. Take a pause for reflection. And remember, above all, that recognizing these requests is just the beginning. The real path begins when you choose to place yourself at the center of your own life. If you have come this far, it is because something inside you already knew that certain requests are not just loose phrases. They are signs. They are coded messages from someone else's psyche. They are attempts to mold, silence, or control. And now you have names for these signs. You recognize them. Let's recall. Don't show your emotions. This request reveals a man at war with his own vulnerability, projecting onto you the rigidity he learned to use as a defense. Change for me. Here, the projection of the anima turns you into an ideal and not a real human being. Loving, in this case, demands that you stop being who you are. Forget your past. An unconscious appeal for you to disconnect from your roots, your scars, your history, everything that makes up your soul. Prove to me that you love me all the time. The wounded child trying to protect himself within an adult body. The relationship that becomes an account of duties. Don't talk about this with anyone. The persona that demands silence to maintain the illusion. The isolation that comes disguised as privacy. You are exaggerating. The subtle but relentless gaslighting that turns your intuition into doubt and your truth into exaggeration. And finally, if you leave me, I will destroy everything. The shadow that threatens, that suffocates, that tries to keep you out of fear, not out of love. These 7 requests, analyzed through Jung's lens, reveal not only patterns of male behavior, but also the breaking points where many women stop listening to themselves, where they distance themselves from their essence to maintain a connection that in reality never was true, or if it was, ceased to be when it began to demand your negation. But here is the most important point. The problem was never you feeling too much, wanting to speak, wanting to understand, wanting to grow. The problem lies when the other person demands that you stop being who you are so that they can continue being who they pretend to be. The process of individuation, according to Jung, is the path to becoming whole, to integrate light and shadow, desire and fear, freedom and connection. And this is only possible when you look at yourself with honesty. When you say, "This is not about the other, it is about what I accept, about where I abandon myself, about what I choose to repeat or interrupt." This journey is not easy. It implies cuts, it implies farewells, it implies solitude sometimes, but above all it implies power. Because only when you free yourself from the requests that try to mold you, do you begin to hear the calls that come from within, the ones that ask for truth, freedom, presence, and unconditional love. So, may this video not be just another piece of content you watched. May it be a mirror, a seed, a turning point. Return to it whenever you need to remember your truth. Share it with other women who may be experiencing these requests without being able to name them. And if this video touched you on any level, like it, subscribe to the channel, and share it. Because spreading awareness is the beginning of any collective transformation. The female psyche is deep, wild, creative. It was not made to fit into molds. And you, exactly as you are already whole. This is your reminder. And also your call to return home, within yourself.